Welcome to the Career Now podcast. I'm your host Jed Lea-Henry, and on today's show we have Professor Mitchell Lerner talking about his book, The Pueblo Incident. Now, if there's any moment that really describes just how hard it is to talk and to negotiate with North Korea, it's got to do with the attack, the capture, and the imprisonment of the crew of the USS Pueblo in 1968. This is an absolutely remarkable story. The sort of thing that challenges the way you think. It's farcical, it's funny, it's tragic, it's horrific, it's absolutely terrifying. It's something that is hard to imagine, and yet something that has also been forgotten by most people. It's one of those moments in history that just disappears off the map. The USS Pueblo began its life in absolutely ignominious fashion. It was launched into the American Great Lakes. For the first 20 years of its life, it didn't have a name. It was then commandeered by the Navy, used as a passenger ship, a freight ship, and then eventually reorganized and re-augmented and pushed into service as a spy boat. Not because it had the capability, but because it had the one thing that the NSA and naval intelligence wanted. It was unassuming. It was unthreatening. No one that looked at it could really think that this boat was a problem to them. So in its preparation, the USS Pueblo was entirely underdone. It wasn't fitted with anything that it needed, and all the maintenance problems that it had simply weren't fixed. Captain Pete Booker complained, and people just ignored him. They knew, at least they believed, that this was not going to happen. There was never going to be an attack on a US ship by what was then a communist ally. Because after all, the Soviet Union were doing this to America. America simply complained, pushed back, sometimes harassed those ships, but never crossed the line into open warfare. So in early January 1968, the USS Pueblo is pushed out to sea just off the coast of North Korea. At almost the same moment, North Korean commandos land on the east coast of South Korea, try and storm the Blue House, try and kill President Park Chung-hee, and no one in the Pueblo is told about this. And this is just one of a series of incidents that shows a growing disdain for international norms and a growing aggression towards the outside world. But the Pueblo still was pushed out to sea and sat there under the assumption that there was a minimal risk operation. Soon enough, the ship was taken, it was captured, it was dragged into harbour, and Robert McNamara, at the time, still Secretary of State, saw this and saw in the Pueblo's taken an incident that he believed was comparable with the Cuban Missile Crisis, something that could start a full-scale nuclear conflict. The crew is tortured, they're beaten, and they're forced to confess. Yet through tremendous acts of courage, when propaganda videos are sent back to America, with these US sailors confessing to their crimes, these men, these captives, even after weeks and weeks of torture, have the courage, the conviction, the moxie, have the fortitude to try and take advantage of North Korea's lack of English language skills and Western culture. In videos taken after the event, they can be seen showing the middle finger to the camera. For this, the torture increased, and they were punished again. They spent 11 months in captivity in the worst possible conditions. And as Professor Mitchell Lerner will describe in this interview, it was all for propaganda. There was no other purpose. It was simply to try and cement the rule of Kim Il-sung, not so much internationally, but domestically. As a small piece of final housekeeping, this interview was conducted via a phone line. So if there's any poor connection, I apologize for that. If you enjoy this podcast, or consider it valuable in any way, please consider contributing to its upkeep. This can be done at the Patreon link attached to this podcast. So, without any further ado, this is Mitchell Lerner. Mitchell Lerner, welcome to the Career Now podcast.
Hi, Jed. Thanks for having me.
Not a problem. So let's set the scene a little bit here. The Pueblo incident happens in 1968. But let's go back a couple of years, not to the Pueblo itself, not to the Pueblo's specific mission, but to Operation Click Beetle in general. What was that?
So, in the 1960s, the U.S. government decided they needed to do a better job of collecting intelligence overseas. It stemmed from the Cuban Missile Crisis and the early stirrings of the Vietnam War and some other things. And what they decided was one of the best ways to do this was to set up these mobile eavesdroppers. And this is, of course, before we're at a point where satellites are as sophisticated as they are today. So they decided they would take these old Navy ships, generally dilapidated old cargo carriers that were pretty much worthless and in most cases had been retired, and they would convert them and turn them into electronic intelligence collectors. And that way they could send them around the world. It was this fairly cheap and mobile answer, so it meant that they wouldn't have to have a ton of ships. This was an era of tight budget restraints, particularly with Robert McNamara, Secretary of Defense. So they put a lot of money, a moderate amount of money, into creating a fleet of naval ships configured for electronic intelligence collection missions. It actually stemmed from a National Security Agency program, and when that proved successful, the Navy said, hey, we want one of our own. So they set it up. They called it Operation Click Beetle. It started with started with 3 ships, actually. The first one was the USS Banner, which ran about 8 missions in the East Sea and some other areas. Most of which were pretty successful, although they proved to be a little risky, and some problems with the ship that rang up immediately that the Navy probably should have paid attention to, but they didn't. And so, thrilled with the early success of the Banner, they expanded it and decided they needed more of these naval intelligence collectors. And the next 2 were the Palm Beach and the Pueblo. And the Pueblo, of course, didn't really cover itself with glory.
Sure. So let's go back to the Pueblo. It had some incredibly unexciting beginnings to its life. It was launched in 1944, and it's originally just a passenger ship or a freight ship. It's not made for the sort of mission that it was sent out on.
No, it was a nothing of a ship. It was a cheap cargo carrier that was designed to ferry materials from point A to point B. It lasted about 10 years. I mean, it served fine. It just wasn't anything exciting. A tiny ship, with 33 feet wide, 180 feet long. It was designed to carry something like 40 people. And so then it was retired in 1954, and it sat there in rust and mothballs for almost a decade before the Navy said, this is the kind of ship that we wanted. So they took it out of retirement, added kind of a deck on the top with sophisticated intelligence collection materials. They dramatically expanded its complement of crewmen, and off they said, ready to go.
Sure. So let's talk about the conversion process a little bit more closely. So what exactly happened? What was the fit-ins like? And how did it all come out?
God, it was a disaster, Jed. So here's the underlying thing here. The U.S. Navy operates this program on the assumption that the Soviet Union does this to us, and we don't attack the ships, and so therefore our ships will be safe doing it off the coasts of communist nations. And we can have a larger discussion here about how this sort of encapsulates the Cold War, and I think it really does. Like, this is the American government saying, since the Soviets do this to us, all communist bloc states will respect and react the same way that they do. And never really gave any thought to the idea that there are specific differences within the communist bloc nations. And so when the American government sat down to start this program, really the idea of protecting these ships or keeping them safe was just not very important. It was assumed that you could send a falling apart tugboat right off the coasts of any of these nations, and it would be fine, because the international sort of accepted norms of behavior were that we accepted these ships, you didn't want them inside your territorial waters, but even if they strayed in, you just sort of gave them a warning and sent them on their way. And so that meant, in the eyes of American planners, particularly those trying to, keep things pretty cheap in terms of conversion, that all the Pueblo needed to be, like the Banner and the Palm Beach and the other ships, all it needed to do is be able to float. Right? I mean, if this thing could get from point A to point B, let's sink our money into intelligence collection materials and not worry about anything else. And so the Navy dramatically slashed the budget to convert the ship and get it seaworthy. And as a result, it was a complete disaster. Now, I mean, I could fill your entire podcast with a litany of disasters in terms of conversion, but I'll give you just a couple of examples.
Sure, yep.
The ship's steering engine was so bad that it was constantly slipping out of gear. And even just a couple months before the ship was sent to North Korea, on all of its in-service tests, its sort of pre-mission tests, they kept having to be dragged in by tugboat.
Yeah, at one point you mentioned that on its first day of testing, it lasted 20 or 15 minutes at sea and had to get dragged back in?
Yeah. It's incredible, isn't it? I mean, we're sending this ship to North Korea, for God's sakes. This isn't a vacation cruise in the Bahamas. You're sending a ship to operate for the first time in North Korea, and I'm sure down the road you and I can talk about what things are like in North Korea in 1968.
Yep.
But their assumption was that the ship would be safe. So they didn't care that the ship didn't really have a self-destruct mechanism. I mean, it had a very, very basic system, but nothing that could do the job. They didn't care that the ship didn't have adequate equipment to destroy the classified gear and classified materials. They didn't even give it an incinerator to burn the papers that they had accumulated. In order to destroy the top-secret code radios that were encased in steel and built into the wall, they gave them in fire axes and sledgehammers, which were useless. To get rid of the top-secret intelligence documents that they were carrying, they gave them 22 weighted bags, and they said, fill the bags with the paper and throw it overboard, which doesn't make much sense when the whole point of the ship is to operate right near the coast of an enemy state. So it was disaster after disaster.
So let's flush out
of the critical
I'll just get you to flush out that first point just before we push on. You said one of the great failures in this was the inability of the American government to understand that North Korea wasn't just another communist puppet, that they may react differently to how the Soviet Union or other closer allies to the Soviet Union would react.
Yeah, so that's the underlying failure here. And just as we were talking a minute ago about how that made it so that the military people in charge weren't so concerned about the safety and stability of the ship, it kind of encompassed every aspect of the Pueblo, and it's really the defining element of this period of the Cold War. So when the intelligence community does its mission assessment evaluation, they operate on the assumption that the ship is going to be safe because the Soviets do this to the United States and we accept it. And so if you go through sort of the checklists of all the points that the intelligence community was supposed to evaluate before they could approve this ship as a minimal risk, you can only go on the mission if all the different intelligence levels evaluated the mission and said this was a minimal risk. Well, some of the criteria, there's no way this was minimal risk. Right? The criteria included things like the political sensitivity of the target nation. Right? I mean, this is North Korea. Some of the other things included the weather and previous missions. I mean, there were all sorts of red flags. And yet, inside the military, inside the intelligence circles, inside the Johnson administration, the assumption was that, you know, there's us versus them. And inside the communist bloc, they were all sort of servile puppets of the Chinese and the Soviets. And as long as the superpowers were on board, their behavior would be predictable. So that's the story of the Pueblo in a nutshell, and in a sense, that's the story of the Cold War.
So if we just push back to that fit-in for just a moment there. Because they're not expecting anything to actually happen, it's not fitted with any, like you said, self-destruct mechanisms for the intelligence, and there's no real armaments on the boat, but also there's a almost farcical situation when they're doing those fit-ins, that it's so top secret that the people putting the boat together couldn't know what it was meant to be used for. So they'll fit in all sorts of things that weren't necessary.
Yeah. I mean, isn't that amazing that, you know, they're doing, and some of it is stupid, right? So they're beating into the hull the wrong designation for the ship. And so that's going to cost them, you know, a few $1,000s to fix. But the captain is sitting there looking at them, watching it, and thinks, I can't even tell them not to do it that way because they're not classified to know. But I mean, it was a problem on a lot of the practical levels. So people, you know, laying out gear didn't necessarily know what the ship's operations were. People planning involving the lower level of selecting the targets and that sort of thing. They just didn't have the security classifications to know how to design the ship, how to prepare the ship, and the end result was disaster.
So you just mentioned the captain there, and he's going to be a pivotal role in all of this. So that's Captain Booker. So if you can explain a little bit about him, and then maybe the crew itself, what was it like?
Yeah, so Pete Booker, this was his first command. He had worked his way up kind of through the submarine ranks and was a real sort of old-fashioned, you know, kind of a tough guy who the crew liked and respected. He was kind of one of those guys who got along with the crew and didn't want to control through fear and tension. He was kind of a regular guy, and he would go out for drinks and hang out. And so there was kind of somewhat of a close bond there. He didn't get along very well with his second in command, though, a very different personality, much more of a by-the-book traditionalist. So that was kind of an issue. But, I mean, the bigger failures in terms of the ship's crew and the officers, is that they just weren't prepared for their jobs. And this maybe goes back to the point you were making earlier about the classification level. So people who don't really know what the mission is, or in some cases do know what the mission is but assume everything is going to work out perfectly, don't really care so much about the qualifications of the people who are playing some of these critical roles. So they assigned to Pueblo, for example, 2 translators. There were 2 Marines whose entire training to learn the Korean language was like I forget, it was either a 3 or a 6 month training class, and that was it. And so these are the guys this is an electronic intelligence ship, so they're intercepting the North Korean communications. Had these guys really been fluent in the language, they might have picked up messages in advance warning them that North Korean ships were coming out to get them. Instead, they were days behind in their translating, and so they just never knew that this was happening.
Yes.
And that was just up and down the chain of command.
Yeah. So that's quite amazing. So this is a spy ship, an intelligence ship. And the best they can do in terms of translation is 2 people with 3 to 6 months skills in this area.
Yeah. Yeah. It's and again, it's going to North Korea, for God's sakes.
Yeah.
Right? This is anyone who has even a basic knowledge understands not only is this an unpredictable nation in the best of times, but in 1968, we're in the middle of this period, we sometimes call it the Second Korean War, where there's violence and there's chaos. And I mean, the military attacks across the parallel that had stepped up so much in late 67. And yet here's the American government just telling this ship, go on about your way, you'll be fine.
So despite all of that, it's considered and marked as a minimal risk operation, and it's pushed out into the East Sea, and it sits off the coast of, I think, Wonsan and Chongqing, and it's looking for, now, I think you said it's looking for potentially a new submarine design from North Korea, or even something coming from the Russian fleet in Vladivostok.
Yeah, I mean, we're not 100% sure even today what exactly it was looking for, and I suspect that's because no one inside the American Navy or intelligence community really knew specifically what they were looking for either. I think it just seemed like North Korea would be a good target. So the ship's orders include a lot of different things. It's mostly to just sort of survey the electronic environment along the coast, particularly Chongqing and Wonsan, and see what you can find out. There were some rumors that the Soviets might be testing a new missile in the area around Vladivostok, and so maybe that would prove fruitful, or maybe there were some new rumors of new submarines going on. So, I mean, I wasn't there in the room, obviously, but my general sense from looking at the documents is that no one ever really said, this is our one specific objective. Instead, it was your sort of classic groupthink where everyone thought, yeah, we should get something on North Korea, but maybe didn't know exactly what it would be.
And just before we move on there, you did mention just before, and I didn't pick up on it, that previous operations in the exact same area a year or so earlier had been harassed by the North Koreans already.
Yeah, so that's one of the most amazing things about this minimal risk designation, right? The thing that they're supposed to take into consideration is a couple things. But one of the chief ones is what happened on prior missions. Well, the Banner had been sent into the East Sea, I think it's 3 times. And they've been harassed. They've been harassed by the Chinese. They've been actually, I think they had run 8 operations total, and they've been harassed on almost all of them. And a number of them were severe enough that they had to call for help. And now by the time American ships came to rescue them, the Banner had escaped from whoever was harassing them, and no major incident had broken out. And yet, American military intelligence planners, instead of looking at this and saying, wow, this is potentially dangerous, we better make sure we have support forces on alert in case the Pueblo or other ships have problems, they looked at it as confirmation. They said, sure, these ships are getting harassed, but it's just routine harassment and nothing's going to come of it. So they just sort of glossed over it and again, off went to Pueblo. And what's really kind of astounding, and I know obviously all of these missions are risky, but this is the Pueblo's first mission. I mean, the first time out there with an inexperienced crew and all the mechanical difficulties, and their target is North Korea in January, for God's sakes.
So they're pushed out, and there's no immediate response organized from Japan despite this. So let's go to January 21. They're floating in the East Sea. The weather's bad. It's quite an awful place to be at this time of year. And on January 21, they encounter a boat in the sea, but it's also at the exact same day that there's an attack on the Blue House in Seoul. So what were both those things?
Yeah, and there's another sort of amazing failure of the American government to not see the larger picture of the Blue House raid on the 21st. So the Pueblo, it starts its mission, and not much happens over the course of those first few days. It's relatively boring. They don't intercept anything all that exciting. And then, so the 21st is when they have their first encounter, and it's not really all that exciting either. It's a North Korean ship. I think it's an SO-1 subchaser. It just sort of blows by them. And maybe they've been seen, maybe they haven't. The ship doesn't seem to have recognized them, and if it did, it didn't necessarily recognize them as Americans. So they chat about it. The officers of the Pueblo chat about it, and they decide they're going to just keep on their mission because they don't think anything major has happened. And yet what they don't know is that at the same time, the North Koreans had sent a team of commandos across the parallel in an attempt to assassinate South Korean President Park Chung-hee. And it comes shockingly close on the 21st. They get within a couple hundred yards of the Blue House. I mean, there's a whole story behind this raid, and I'm sure your listeners know most of it. But these commandos come pretty close, and if it wasn't for the fact that they had at one point run across a group of outdoorsmen, a group of tree cutters out in the woods who are doing some work in the wilderness, and they decide not to kill them. They just sort of tie them up and try to indoctrinate them into communism, and then they let them go. And so these guys sound the alarm, and so the local police force is ready. I mean, who knows what might have happened? But anyway, so they fail in their mission, and they're killed, and one of them is captured, but no one bothers to tell the men of the Pueblo. And the Captain Booker, was later quite clear that if someone had said to him, hey, there was just this assassination attempt and things on the Korean Peninsula are really starting to boil over, he would have handled things differently. But no one thinks of the Pueblo, and they are left out there. Yeah,
yes, that's amazing, isn't it? So the next day, January 22, they're surrounded by 2 North Korean boats this time.
Yeah, so now is when they know the gig is kind of up. So 2 North Korean ships come out. These are sort of military-style trawlers. I mean, they're fairly dilapidated Russian. I think they're Lencher-class trawlers that have been converted for military use. And they approach the Pueblo. They kind of circle a little bit. They follow around. They come up close. They communicate with each other. And then suddenly they make kind of a beeline into North Korea. So it's quite clear to the captain and his men that they have been spotted. And now they've got to start taking things a little bit more seriously.
Yeah, and then the next day, January 23, in the morning, they are now surrounded by a much larger fleet of ships, and Captain Booker begins to actually flee the scene. He starts heading out to open waters. He realizes this is the moment. It's all going to happen.
Yeah, so all hell breaks loose the next day. They think that they're still safe. They've got no information about what's going on inside of Korea. They've been told that maybe they should expect routine harassment. They're told this all throughout the mission preparation, and that they shouldn't panic. So they haven't panicked. They're hanging around in the area. And first one of these SO-1 subchasers comes out, and then followed by 3 others, as well as a couple torpedo boats. And they surround the Pueblo, and they run some circles around it. And the commander Captain Booker thinks he's, just being harassed, and it's all going to be okay. But then the North Koreans prepare a boarding party, and one of the ships starts backing down in the Pueblo with the clear intention of dropping some of its soldiers onto the Pueblo. And the captain suddenly realized this is a little bit more serious than he thought. He tries to escape. They head out to open water, but the Pueblo's a disaster. I mean, it can go about 13 knots, which is nothing compared to the other ships. They've got a couple guns. They've got 2 50 caliber machine guns, but I mean, they're completely outgunned, completely outmaneuvered. I mean, they really have no chance here at all.
Let's touch on those 2 machine guns for just a second here, because people listening might be asking, at this point, why didn't they shoot back? Why didn't they fire? And this would be important later when Booker gets back to America as well. This would be an important point.
So the Navy wanted to know that also. You're right. So it's a lot more complicated than that. I mean, first of all, even if the guns were in great shape and everything was perfect, there's still no match for the North Korean ships surrounding them. 50 caliber machine guns are perfectly nice weapons. They're not made for the cold weather. They ice easily. They jam easily. They're certainly not good on a bouncing around vessel. Remember, the Pueblo is tiny, so getting it stable enough to shoot is virtually impossible. But even beyond that, So it was installed at the last minute, largely in the wake of the attack on the USS Liberty. So what they did is they put gun mounts on the deck, and the guns were in storage. They were under tarps and they were frozen. So to get the guns out would have required going out onto the deck, chiseling away the ice, and getting the guns out. And the deck is not protected. So anybody doing that in times of shooting is just going to be killed. Even then, so then they would have to, in the times of an attack, right, in the context of the chaos of what would be a military assault on the ship, they're expected to mount the guns, and there's no protection. So they're out in the open, and even then, because of the way they were mounted, they could only cover a portion of the ship. They didn't have 360-degree coverage. So it was really the likelihood of even getting the guns up was virtually non-existent, to say nothing of what good they would have done if they had them up. So, yeah, when the ship came back, and a lot of people said, I don't understand why these guys didn't fight back, and they had machine guns, and they had some pistols and some Thompson submachine guns below deck. But under the specific circumstances, the men weren't even really trained with them. But, I mean, more than anything, the way it was laid out meant that it was going to be virtually impossible for them to fight this off. And all that Bucher knew, all he would have done by sending men to try to get the machine guns up would have been to send them to their death.
So through all this, Bucher is essentially stalling for time. He's been sending out radio messages, and this is where the farce begins to grow a little bit deeper, because there's this strange situation where some people don't know they're even in the area, and there's some planes that can't come for all sorts of strange reasons.
Yeah, it's a failure on so many different levels. So Bucher is trying to radio for help. Now, we haven't even talked about the failures of the communication system on the Pueblo, which also were god-awful. So it took them like almost 24 hours to even get good communication set up with the Navy. But even beyond that, so no one had really thought to put support forces on alert. Now, there were plenty of planes in the area that had they been put on alert and had they been fueled up and configured for fighting and had a pilot ready to go, they could have launched in an hour or so and could have been there in time to do something. And so Bucher assumes this is what's going on. He's been told there's going to be support forces on alert, so he's stalling for time. He's sending messages to the North Korean. He's at one point he kind of feigns mechanical breakdown, pretends the ship just can't move. So he's stalling for time. And yet the reality is, because no one had put support forces on alert, no one was ready. So we had planes not too far away that could have been there in time, except they were configured for atomic bombs and not configured for conventional combat. There were other planes that were out on patrol exercises or not fully fueled. I mean, just a litany of errors across the board. So the bottom line is Bucher thinks, stall for time, someone's going to send help, but no one's sending help.
So Bucher eventually realizes that the game is up here, and he surrenders. And as they're heading back to North Korea, you touched on it just as we started, that the failure to put those self-destruct mechanisms for the intelligence in becomes this, and once again, a farce as they're trying to rapidly destroy the intelligence on the way back to North Korea.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing. This is a top-secret intelligence collector. It's configured with everything. It's got code words. It's got the results of earlier intelligence operations. It's got the electronic order of battle for the Far East. It has so much important paper material, to say nothing of the machinery itself. It's got a KW7 code radio, which is the ultimate in communications for the United States at this point. And yet, when planning the operation, no one thought to better prepare the ship for self-destruct. So the North Koreans open fire. Bucher says, "Oh my God, we're in trouble," and he orders the men to start destroying the gear, and the papers and everything else. And it's a disaster. So in the particularly sensitive, what they call the Special Operations Department area, there's like no windows, and the doors are locked, and so they have no self-destruct gear in there. They have actually a useless paper shredder that can shred like one piece of paper per minute. So they start fires to try to destroy this, and that just means the smoke fills up in the room. Meanwhile, they're taking sledgehammers to steel encased machinery. They're filling bags, these weighted bags that I mentioned, with classified materials, but because of the gunfire going up on top of the bridge, they can't get there to throw them overboard. So when the North Koreans finally capture the ship, there's like these 10 weighted bags full of hundreds of pounds of American classified materials that the North Koreans just pick up. So there's just nothing really to do about it. We've got, intelligence estimates now from the National Security Agency and other intelligence communities talking about how this was just an absolutely devastating, one of the worst intelligence losses in American history. And we know, of course, that the North Koreans immediately shared it with the Soviet Union. So all of this was lost. And you can only imagine the sense of frustration, right? Bucher everything has let him down. There's no support forces coming. His ship can barely move. The guns don't work. And now here they are entrusted with all this top secret gear. And he knows the North Koreans are going to come and get all of it.
Yeah. So just on a last point before we move on to their treatment in captivity here. For people listening, the international boundary of a state is 12 nautical miles off its coast. Did the USS Pueblo violate that 12-mile limit?
So the answer to that is definitively yes and no. So here's what I mean. At the time of the attack, they were in international waters, and we know it's not even close. And we know that from lots of intelligence avenues, not the least of which was the North Koreans were transmitting the North Korean ships attacking the Pueblo were transmitting their location back into Wonsan Harbor, and South Korean and American intelligence picked that up. So by even the North Koreans' own admission, the Pueblo was in international waters. Over the course of the preceding, days of operation, we're less sure. And one suspects, although we don't really know, one suspects that they probably got closer than that 12-mile limit than they were supposed to. And there's some circumstantial evidence that suggests that they probably had. But they never, again, anecdotally, they never came, if they violated that territorial boundary, they didn't violate it by a lot. And I suppose more importantly, at the time of the attack, they were clearly in international waters. Now, the North Koreans would later manufacture a whole bunch of evidence, and it's almost kind of comical. So they manufactured fake charts plotting all of the Pueblo's alleged violations of their waters, except in some cases they had the Pueblo going at impossible speeds, 3-4 times faster than it could go. And a couple of their locations where they claim the Pueblo had violated their territorial waters were actually so badly plotted that they actually had the Pueblo inland, like, driving down the streets of Wonsan Harbor. So, I mean, the North Koreans would claim, and propaganda, throughout the socialist bloc insisted that they had violated territorial waters. There's certainly no hard evidence to prove that.
Okay, so they're captured, they're towed back into Wonsan Harbor, and the crew members. Sorry, I have to mention just briefly. One crew member is killed in a brief shootout, and then the rest. Then the boat is towed back in, and the rest are imprisoned in effectively prison camps and tortured. Yeah. So there's 83 men on the Pueblo. One of them is killed during the attack. He's actually, the irony is he's not killed during the first attack. So the North Korean ships, they surround the Pueblo, they open fire, they do all sorts of damage, but everyone's still alive. And then when they start, the North Koreans order the Pueblo to follow them into Wonsan, and Captain Bucher does. He starts following in, and then he's still trying to stall for time, like we were saying. So he pretends his ship has broken down, cuts the engine and kind of feigns helplessness to try to stall for time, and the North Koreans open fire again. And that's when they kill the American crewmen. They wound a number of others, including Bucher himself. And then they at that point, the North Koreans say enough of this, and they actually board the ship. They tie the men up. They put them in the forward berthing compartment, and they tow the ship into Wonsan, where the men are then dragged out onto land, where there's a crowd of North Koreans screaming at them and attacking them, and then they are taken by bus into North Korean prison camps, which proves to be a pretty horrific experience. Yeah. So the just before we get into this, because it sounds a very basic sort of tortures, beatings, and things like crawling on broken glass, but it really was quite a dramatic experience for these people, of course. And afterwards, you mentioned that some of the injuries they experienced lasted for the rest of their lives. Yeah.
So it is really primitive. I mean, and you're right. This is, North Korea is not very sophisticated in this, but I guess the point is you don't necessarily have to be all that sophisticated in torture. Right? I mean, the men were just beaten. They were beaten with clubs. They were beaten with sticks. They were forced to sit on hot radiators. They were forced to crawl over broken glass. They were just forced to sit in certain positions for hours and hours. And you might say, God, that's, so many other things that you could do. Well, yeah, but this was still pretty horrific. And so the men, they started on Bucher. He was the first one, and they tortured him, and then they moved on to the officers, and then eventually worked their way down the crew. Some lasted longer than others. But in the end, they all received some form of abuse. A few of them really, really god-awful. And some of them rebounded, but really, if you look at the long history of these men since they returned to the United States, a lot of them never got over it. Not physically, not mentally, not emotionally. There's high rates of divorce and alcoholism and unemployment and physical issues. So, yeah, it was a very primitive sort of torture, but damn if it wasn't effective.
And people may imagine that torture these days, well, wherever it does occur, is done for information. But this wasn't. This was just done for confessions, I understand. Yeah,
and so this goes to one of the larger questions that we often debate, in sort of the circle of Korea watchers. What's North Korea's motive here? And this is one of the things we focus on. They're not interested in intelligence information. They're not interested in military and strategic stuff. They want propaganda. They want domestic propaganda that the Kim family will use at home to sort of demonstrate to his people how strong he is, how he made the Americans kneel to him. And so the men are beaten and tortured essentially until they sign confession. And it just grows on from there. It starts with just confession letters, then it becomes more lengthy confession letters and apology statements, and then they start writing letters home. And the men at various times are taken into public for press conferences and tours of North Korean exhibits. And it is so much about this propaganda effort, this need for Kim Il-sung to demonstrate, his strength and his power, that's what these sessions are all about.
Yeah. And so through that, we might touch on what some of the crew did. So they were tortured, and it's really quite a traumatic experience. But it's a huge amount of courage, and this is quite funny, of course, but if it wasn't such a tragic situation overall. The crew start writing these messages home, and they start sending them to mental hospitals, so people back home will get on with the joke. And in some of the pictures, they start giving their middle fingers to the camera, and the North Koreans don't realize what they're doing.
Yeah. It is kind of a, I don't mean to sound melodramatic, but it's kind of a triumph of the human spirit here. I mean, these guys are beaten. They're in a prison camp, and it's dark, and, the food is awful, and they have it's as bad as it can be. And so for the first few weeks, they cooperate, and some of them hold out a while. They refuse to sign confessions. They refuse to apologize, but eventually they all break, because eventually you all do. But after a while, and the North Koreans maybe slacked off a little bit, and this just became sort of part of the routine. And slowly but surely, the men started slipping like hidden messages into some of these apology letters and some of these letters home. And some of them are silly. They would, talk about, the North Koreans are the nicest people since my last visit to St. Elizabeth's, which is this mental hospital that you mentioned. They talked about, it's just lots of little things. They would throw names in there. This is, make sure you say hi to uncle or aunt when they'd name some movie star or something. Just, silly little things. And it got more and more extreme. There were times when they had a couple press conferences where they sort of mocked the North Koreans to their face in ways that the North Koreans, just not subtle with American language, picked up. But it all came to a head with what they called the Hawaiian good luck charm. And this was a moment the North Koreans would expose them to propaganda videos. And at one point they showed them a video of the North Korean soccer team playing a match in London, North Korean football team, I suppose you would say, playing a match in London. And in the middle of it, I think at halftime, as the North Koreans ran off, the British fans, gave them the finger. They extended their middle fingers, and the North Korean players just sort of bowed and smiled. And so the Pueblo men watching this in the video, they say, oh my God, these guys don't know what that symbol means. And so they started, extending their middle fingers towards the North Koreans. They'd have publicity photos that the North Koreans would use for propaganda, and the men would sit there with their middle fingers out. And when the North Koreans said, what is this? They said, it's a Hawaiian good luck symbol. It's just something that we do to wish you good luck. And in the irony was the North Koreans started doing it themselves, giving each other the finger to say good luck.
Yep.
And it was, it's inspirational. It was this sort of, this symbolic act of resistance that I actually think helped get the men through it. But then, of course...
That's an important point, because in some circles they were accused of being treasonous, at least at the start. Yeah. And just on the point about the Hawaiian good luck symbol, Captain Pete Booker has his own moment of triumph in this sense. So he's asked to write his own confession, and he puts in this word "paeon," which means triumph. Yeah. And he deliberately mispronounces it.
Yeah, so he's going to pee on his North Korean captors. Yeah, there's a lot of that. And, I mean, you're absolutely right. And the men get accused of all sorts of things. You know, they wrote these, and it's really crazy. You know, you have these naval people saying, oh, they should have gone down with the ship, or they should have fought harder. I never would have signed off on those confession letters. And you just kind of want to shake them and say, so first of all, you didn't spend a year in a North Korean prison camp. Don't tell me what you would have done. But beyond that, like, if there's failures here, it's not the men. It's the guys who sent them into harm's way without any protection, without any training, without any communication, without any self-defense. And to just expect them to, you know, fight until you are dead because of the failures of the American intelligence community and military communities is kind of ridiculous. So, so I think that this kind of helped get them through it, that these small token gestures helped kind of inspire them. And then eventually, I think it was Newsweek reprinted one of these photos. One of the men had sent a photo home, and so I think it was Newsweek reprinted it with the middle finger, and they said in the caption something about, you know, what the middle finger really means, and it set off a week of torture and abuse. The men called it Hell Week. That was just awful. I mean, it took it to a whole nother level. There were lots of them didn't think they would survive, almost didn't want to survive. The beatings were so bad. You know, 24-hour round-the-clock torture and beatings, because the North Koreans, you know, again, if we're going to argue that this is really about, you know, propaganda and demonstrating what, you know, how strong you are, being made to look foolish like that was really the worst thing that could have happened.
Yep. So let's broaden this slightly here. So Lyndon Johnson is in power at the moment, and you have edited 2 books on Lyndon Johnson. So what was the broader context? What was his response in all of this? Because at the time, 1968 is also the peak of the Vietnam War.
Yeah, so he's got his hands full. So when this all hits, the really interesting thing is, and this is despite what lots of people are saying now, because there's been some sort of revisionism about this, but he never seriously considers a military assault. Johnson sits down with his advisors over the course of the first week of the Pueblo incident, and they say, what are we going to do? And they come up with 3 things. There's 3 goals here that underlie everything they do over the next 11 months. And so one of those goals is we got to get the men home alive. Another goal is we've got to keep South Korea under control, because Baek Chung-hee, he wants vengeance and he wants retaliation against the North. And the last thing we need is another war in East Asia right now. And then the third goal is to keep our eye on the ball in Vietnam, to not get divided, to keep our forces concentrated in Vietnam, to keep the Korean forces fighting in Vietnam. So these are the goals. And what ends up happening is, because there is no way to sort of get the men home without expanding the war into Korea, without setting off maybe a second Korean War, they decide from really the first moment that this has to be a diplomatic solution. Now, if there had been no Vietnam War, I expect things maybe would have gone differently, although Lyndon Johnson clearly throughout this crisis was very concerned with making sure the men were not killed in North Korean prison camps, so maybe things wouldn't have gone differently. But the reality is they were almost as alarmed about losing North Korean support for the war in Vietnam as they were anything happening in Korea. And so the bottom line for them was diplomacy, keep things under control so we have the unified fight going on in Vietnam, and that is what underlays the next year of negotiations.
So this moves into discussions in the middle of the DMZ at Panmunjom, and they start talking, and North Korea demand immediately for the 3 A's, and I'll get you to explain what that is. But there's also a remarkable point that I came across, I'm not sure if this is true, that the North Korean negotiators, for most of it, weren't allowed to respond. They had flashcards, and they could only repeat what was written on the cards. Is that correct?
Yeah, it is. It's really amazing. I mean, any proposal, anything that the American negotiators said in these debates, the answer was basically, I have to go check with someone and I'll get back to you. I mean, obviously that's not the words that they used, but that's what it amounted to. It was, you know, I hear your statement and I will consider it. and then they would call a meeting for 2 days later where they could make a response. So there's absolutely no leeway, no initiative, no nothing inside the North Korean negotiating position.
Sure. So what were the 3 A's? This is what they really wanted from all of this.
Yeah. So the moment this breaks out, the North Koreans say, we want what the Americans later call the 3 A's demand. They want the U.S. to admit that they had violated North Korean territorial waters, apologize for doing so, and assure them that they wouldn't do it again. And the American team of negotiators spends a year trying to work around that. And I mean, they come up with everything. They talk about, maybe they propose the North Koreans will release the men into the hands of a third party. Maybe it's the United Nations, maybe it's the Red Cross, maybe it's another country, whatever. And they'll conduct an investigation. And then if the investigation demonstrates that they had violated the waters, they would make a statement. They reach out to Soviet bloc states, communist bloc states that they had ties with to try to find some sort of compromise there. Everything that they look for. There was a moment when it looked like we might solve the Pueblo crisis with what they called the overwrite formula, which is what one of the State Department officials had suggested, which was that have the North Koreans write the 3 A's demand, put it in a letter, and then give it to our negotiator. And we won't sign it necessarily, but we'll write across the top of it in big letters, I acknowledge receipt of the men. And the North Koreans actually thought when the United States proposed that the U.S. was actually going to sign it. And so it looked like the Pueblo men were going to be released. And only at the last minute when the chief negotiator for the U.S. said, no, this is actually what I plan to do, did it all fall apart. So they went through manifestation after manifestation of attempts to find a solution, but in the end, there just was no getting around what the North Koreans wanted, which was the 3 A's demand.
So North Korea were demanding this thing all along, which goes to your point about this being all about propaganda. But do you think that was the reason, so I just broaden it slightly, do you think that was the reason why they took the ship in the first place?
Yeah, I do. And I think that that's probably where we are now with the scholarship. So when I first wrote the book on the Pueblo, we didn't really have access to any of the materials from the communist bloc states. And so I sort of made that argument based on, reading of the evidence and looking at the behavior of the Koreans. But that was the crux of my argument, that this wasn't really about the Cold War. This was about Kim Il-sung needing domestic propaganda because there were some problems going on inside North Korea in the late 1960s. But over the last, 5, 6, 8 years, through the North Korea International Documentation Project in D.C., we started to get access to these North Korean materials. Now, we're not getting them from North Korea, obviously, but we're getting them from the archives of the former communist bloc states and the communications that went on between, Pyongyang and Moscow or all, whatever states that they were dealing with. And I think the overwhelming evidence there supports that hypothesis because even we have messages from the East Germans and the Poles and all of those, the ambassadors and embassy staff with embassies in Pyongyang. And they are reporting back that this is about rallying the people, that what Kim Il-sung is doing is he's holding marches and parades, and he's implementing orders and edicts. Everybody over the age of 5 has to carry a backpack of supplies all the time because the Americans are coming. And there's drills and there's propaganda, and everything seems designed very clearly to rally the people, particularly in the face of the economic decline. And so even this is what even the communist bloc representatives are saying. They're saying, we don't really think he wants war. We don't really think this is a strategic military issue. We think that he is trying to reinforce his cult of personality, rally the people against the West, provide an excuse for domestic shortcomings, and the Pueblo just seems to be a critical element of that strategy.
Yeah, so the Pueblo is taken in January 1968, and through the summer they're negotiating and getting absolutely nowhere, of course. And then a State Department official, James Leonard, goes home, complains to his wife, and his wife comes up with the solution to the whole problem. Yeah.
So it's kind of funny, right? We have all these experienced diplomats raking in the money and all their years of expertise, and they can't find a solution. And one day James Leonard goes home and he's talking to his wife, Eleanor, and sort of explodes that they're just going to have to sign this 3 A's letter because they don't see any way around it. And her proposal is, sure, sign the letter, but before you do so, publicly repudiate it, right? So sure, they'll hand you the letter, and you say, yeah, I'm going to sign this, but I'm going to sign it just to get the men back, and it's all garbage. And that's what they do. The U.S. proposes that kind of in desperation, never thinking that the North Koreans are going to accept it. But they do, which I think also reinforces the idea that this was about a domestic audience because they could control that message inside North Korea, and they didn't care so much what the rest of the world thought. So the American negotiator, Major General Woodward, makes that proposal. The North Koreans agree. They prepare this couple-page letter where the United States apologizes, admits, and assures. They hand it to Woodward. He says, this is against the facts. I'm going to sign it only to get the men back. He signs it. The men are released. Everybody is happy.
So they stay 11 months to the day in a North Korean prison, and they are simultaneous as the deal is signed. They simultaneously denounce it, and the men are then walked back across the DMZ, across the Bridge of No Return, as it's aptly called. And when they get back, though, Captain Booker and I think his first officer, they're recommended for court-martials.
Yeah. So the men kind of, they're celebrating. They're walking home. They're back in the United States. Isn't this going to be great? Their family and food and everything. What they haven't really counted on is that there's this really quick outpouring of support. Thank God they're home. Everybody rallies and loves them. But there is this undercurrent, particularly in the military, that thinks they never should have surrendered, and they never should have done the confessions and the apology letters and everything else. And so the Navy appoints a board of inquiry that investigates their behavior. It recommends court-martial for a couple of them and letters of admonition for a whole bunch of others. And it looks like there's going to be a court-martial. Now, at the last minute, the Secretary of the Navy steps in. He recognizes that there's kind of a public relations backlash here, that the American people, rightly, I think, are outraged by this. They think that the Pueblo men are being scapegoated, that there were all sorts of errors, and everyone is kind of at fault here. So there's a public relations backlash, and in the end, the Secretary of the Navy just does away with the court-martials. But that's not it for the men. I mean, they are drummed out of the Navy. They have pretty bad reputations. They have, as I mentioned earlier, physical problems, health problems, emotional issues, and the Navy and the American government doesn't really do anything about it. It's quite clear that the American military and the American government just wants this whole thing to go away. So the men don't get, they don't get the medals that they deserve or even any of the honors that probably should have been accorded to them. But even beyond that, there's very little support psychologically, medically, or anything else as they try to readjust to domestic life.
And I think you also mentioned at one point that the US Navy didn't learn much from the experience at all. They tried to bury it as much as possible, and no real changes was learned from the whole experience.
Yeah, that's true even before the Pueblo, right? So it's not just the Pueblo. There's the Liberty before it's 1967, and there's the Gulf Tonkin incident in '64, and there's this history at this time of these American intelligence collectors not being as safe as the Navy thinks. But nothing really changes. There's an EC-121 spy plane shot down the next year with 31 Americans killed. And then it all kind of fades away. North Korea stops with the aggressive behavior just as quickly and suddenly as it had started. It's suddenly over, and the United States just kind of forgets about the whole thing. And partly, I guess, that's the distractions of Vietnam as well. But this whole thing just sort of fades away and never really amounts to anything.
And the Pueblo today sits on the not on the Taedong River, but on a river just off the Taedong River. But that means at one point it was moved from Wonsan Harbor out into international waters, around the peninsula, around South Korea, and back up. How did they get it there without America taking it back or someone else?
Yeah, it is amazing. That happened in the Clinton years, and now, of course, it's a great propaganda museum for North Korea. It's one of their leading tourist attractions. No one has ever really explained adequately how they got it back into international waters, and the U.S. didn't do anything about it. There have long been rumors that it was kind of a quiet deal, that the U.S. accepted it, and in the hopes of improving relations with North Korea, particularly in the wake of '94 and the agreed framework, that they just accepted this and purposely ordered the military to stand down. I'm not sure I find that convincing. I think more likely it was just that no one was paying attention. And I mean, as crazy as that sounds, this ship was forgotten. I mean, this happened in '68. By the mid-'70s, no one ever talked about the Pueblo. So almost 30 years later, I think this dilapidated, junky old ship probably just, as it started on its journey, was seen as just another North Korean, dilapidated trawler. And most likely, the American military and the American government very rarely works efficiently and expeditiously. My sense is that most likely by the time anyone realized what this actually was, it was too late to act. But, we really don't know, and there are lots of rumors that suggest that the American government knew about it and purposely turned a blind eye.
And now, today, the Pueblo is a tourist attraction. So still sitting on that river, the Potong River, it's still littered with all the bullet holes. You can walk through it. And am I right in assuming that North Korea tried to make the illusion between the USS Pueblo and the USS General Sherman, which also went down that river in 1866 and was shot up and burnt to the ground by the North Koreans, or Koreans at that point?
Absolutely. They celebrate them both. They talk about it happening at they're docked at the same spot as the original incident. It's this big museum, which is a celebration of all of sort of the North Korean triumphs against the West. It is, it is one of their great tourist attractions and propaganda vehicles to celebrate their military triumphs against the West.
So just to round things off a little bit here, the USS Pueblo is still technically a commissioned vessel of the U.S. Navy. So do they want it back? Because at one point, it's been offered a few times or spoken about that this may be a first step or a goodwill gesture or something to do with future negotiations. And of course, there's a broader picture here because there are this specter of negotiations coming, or potentially anyway.
Yeah, who knows what's going through Kim Jong-un's mind and what's going to happen. But certainly, it has come up in rumors in the past that there's a chance it might be returned. It would certainly be a really good opening gesture to try to, normalize relations. I think that the American government would certainly celebrate getting it back. The Trump administration would no doubt play this up as a result of his toughness and North Korea caving in. So I think that it would certainly be welcome. I admit that I don't expect that to happen at this point. As much as I would like to be optimistic about talks between the U.S. and North Korea in the immediate future, I can't say that I am. But
is that because you think it's just going to be another opportunity for propaganda, just like the previous negotiations were with the Pueblo?
Yeah, I do, and I would be happy to be wrong. And there's certainly a chance that I may be. Who really knows what's going to happen here? But if I am looking at this from Kim Jong-un's perspective, a face-to-face meeting with the American president offers great propaganda value. It's going to be splattered across the newspapers and the media inside North Korea, and used as sort of a gesture to South Korea, playing to the sort of racial connections across the border to that said, look, I'm trying to avoid nuclear war because I still care so much about the Korean people. And then I expect he'll turn around and do something. I have no idea what, test something, and things will fall apart. And the United States and the West will have gotten nothing practical out of it, but it will be a nice propaganda victory for North Korea. I would have a lot more confidence if where we were now, if, for example, we had an American ambassador in South Korea, right? If we had a diplomatic staff of expertise, because as I think we all know, right, the diplomatic victories are not won when the two leaders sit down across the table. The hard work is all done in advance. And to find that common ground, you've got to have people advising in the State Department who have expertise in Korea, North and South. And right now, we really just don't. And the State Department has been largely frozen out of all of this. It's mostly, we're now finding out the CIA that has been running the show. So I have some skepticism, but I would certainly love to be proven wrong.
Okay. Well, Mitchell Lerner, it's been an absolute pleasure. Your book on this topic is The Pueblo Incident. Absolutely fascinating. Thanks for coming on the Korea Now podcast.
Thanks for having me.